Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Cardano and its native token, ADA. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go and jump in. It's been about, I think, 4 to 5 months since I last did a dedicated video on Cardano. I mostly just speak about Bitcoin, or sometimes we'll branch out to Ethereum. We'll do stuff on the macroverse. We'll do stuff on Bitcoin dominance. I don't do a ton of videos on individual altcoins. And the reason I haven't, I will explain later in the video. But you should know that while most of the stuff I talk about on this channel, most of the charts that I present are on Bitcoin. For instance, this is the Into the Cryptoverse website, and we've got thousands of different charts. But if you click on any individual chart, let's say the HODL waves, for example, the default is for it to show Bitcoin, right? And you can go look at the long-term holders for Bitcoin. However, while we have a lot of these charts for Bitcoin, and I spend most of my time communicating what Bitcoin is doing, you should know that the website has a lot more functionality than that. And if you click on assets up here, you can find a list of a lot of different cryptocurrencies for a lot of different charts that then you can pull up that chart for that cryptocurrency. So in this case, you're looking at long-term holder HODL waves for Cardano. So my goal in this video is to go through a lot of different charts, explain what my views have previously been, talk about what I've been right about and what I have been wrong about. Try to be as fair as possible, and that's my goal. One thing to do, by the way, on the website, if you do have access to it, one cool thing you can do that I think many people might not know is that if you go over to the asset filter, you can just actually click on any number of cryptocurrencies, right? We have hundreds of different cryptocurrencies on here. But if you want to click on, say, Cardano or whatever you're interested in, it will then load the charts that we have for that asset, right? So then you can see all these charts where, if you just want to click on any random one, let's say days since percentage gain, how long has it been since ADA went up 100%? It'll show you that chart, right? And then you can just click back and you can go to another chart if you want. But it's a pretty cool feature. We've been trying to build this out as best we can for a lot of different cryptocurrencies. So in this video, I'm going to talk about, again, where I think, what I think is the important thing to look at. And I want to explain my bias on this. So my bias, and again, it's not anything against ADA. My bias since 2022 began has been that altcoins will bleed to Bitcoin. That has been my view. I've said it 1,000 times, probably more than 1,000 times. Most everyone's going to know that has been my view, right? And ADA is no exception. I do think that it has been following the general path. So that is something that has been playing out. I wanted to make this video now because ADA Bitcoin is at a pretty crucial level. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about that. It's at a pretty crucial level right now. It's approaching 800 sats. So in general, my view is that when we get to a phase of the market cycle where we can identify it as a region where Bitcoin dominance is going to go up, which is what I came to the conclusion of back over here. I was very, very bullish on Bitcoin dominance, really starting over here. Once I came to the conclusion that Bitcoin dominance was going to go from about 40% up to 60%, what I have said relentlessly is that alts will bleed back to Bitcoin and Bitcoin dominance will go up. Now, so far, that has been playing out collectively. There are some altcoins that have been outperforming Bitcoin, but what you may notice is that a lot of the larger market cap altcoins have been bleeding. And it's not just Cardano, right? It's not just ADA. It's a lot of them. I mean, look at Ethereum. You see how ADA Bitcoin is testing support? Guess what? ETH Bitcoin is testing support. Dot Bitcoin is testing support. It's kind of already below support, right? Matic Bitcoin already lost support. So it's nothing specific about ADA. I mean, I see a lot of different narratives running around, all that sort of stuff, and the narratives can certainly seem convincing at certain stages of the cycle. But I want to tell you why I don't think any of those narratives matter, and I'm going to tell you what I think does matter. And it all comes down for me to monetary policy and the overall trends in the dominance of Bitcoin. Okay? So I want you to think back over the last couple of years for ADA, all right? Think about every narrative there has been about the ADA valuation against Bitcoin. And again, I've been bearish on it for a long time, but I want you to think about every narrative there has been. Has anything turned it around? Not yet. We'll see if it can, but it hasn't happened yet. And I want to show you what happened last cycle that actually turned it around, right? Where did ADA Bitcoin bottom last cycle? Well, it bottomed at 400 sats. Before that, it was also at around 400 sats. So actually less than that. It was all the way down at 270 sats. So 270, then it went up to 400. Now, one of the things that I've received a lot of criticism for over the last couple of years is that a lot of people are assuming that ADA Bitcoin will hold support on this trend line, or at least were assuming that it would hold support. It's starting to look like that might not be the case. And I've been clear that my base case is that it does go below 800 sats. That is my base case. But what actually caused it to bottom? That is what we're interested in here, right? There's 1,000 different narratives that we can come up with. You can talk about the community all you want. None of that stuff matters, right? I mean, we can talk about community, but I mean, that stuff is just, it just doesn't matter, it doesn't. And one of the things that I think is very important with altcoins is what causes them to turn around. Is it the narratives in the media? Is it, whatever the most recent YouTuber said, including me? It's not based on any of that stuff. What if it's simply based on whether we're in a period of quantitative tightening or quantitative easing? Now, unfortunately, we only have one data point to go off of, so I'm not asking you to take this to the bank, at least as far as crypto is concerned. But if you look up thousands of years of monetary policy history, you will in fact see that during higher interest rate environments, higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets. And why is that? It's because we can be more confident that something like Bitcoin will survive over a longer period of time than we can any altcoin, right? I mean, I think most people would agree with that. If you go back to 2013, Bitcoin was number one. If you look at 2011, every year Bitcoin has been number one. Ethereum has been number two, right? I mean, for the last several years, going back to the last cycle back in 2017 when it overtook others to take that spot. But it's been pretty clear that Bitcoin kind of stays around, altcoins come and go. Now, some altcoins go put in new highs in future cycles and some of them don't. One thing about Cardano last cycle that made me interested in it in 2019 was that I thought it had bottomed out against Bitcoin, right? And that was why I was interested in it back then, was because I thought it had bottomed out against Bitcoin in a Bitcoin USD downtrend. And so that made me interested in it. And then it was one of the few altcoins from the prior cycle that was able to take out its high. There have been a lot of altcoins that didn't take out their highs, or the ones that did only went marginally above them. So it's important to recognize that a lot of altcoins can become relics in future cycles. So if you are going to get on board with one, you really hope it's not going to be a relic, right? And that's why I say never marry an altcoin, because you're going to take half in the divorce. Don't marry an altcoin. That's my non-financial advice. So what caused ADA to bottom against Bitcoin? What caused it? My thinking is a shift in monetary policy. If you look at the assets of the Federal Reserve, you will in fact see that it was when the Fed shifted from quantitative tightening, where they were reducing the size of their balance sheet, to quantitative easing, that is precisely where ADA Bitcoin found a bottom. You can see it pretty clearly. It had nothing to do with all the narratives that people are arguing about on X or on YouTube. Nothing to do with any of that stuff. It was just, hey, ADA Bitcoin goes down during QT and ADA Bitcoin goes up during QE. And once again, we find ourselves in a situation where we are in QT. And guess what? ADA Bitcoin's going down. And there were a lot of people last summer, back over here in 2023, that were very adamant that ADA Bitcoin was going to be up only from that point, because the summer of 2020 or the summer of 2019 is when ADA Bitcoin bottomed last cycle. Therefore, once you got to the halving year, right, the general speculation was that it would only go up, only go back up. And why is that? Why is that speculation so convincing for a lot of people? It's because they say that altcoins outperform Bitcoin in a bull run. That's the prevailing narrative, right? That altcoins outperform Bitcoin in a bull run. I've been fairly clear that that is not universally true under all market conditions. It's not. How many times have you heard people say, well, ETH Bitcoin is holding up pretty well compared to last cycle, or ETH will outperform Bitcoin in the bull market? Just you wait, right? But guess what? Despite all of it, it's still down against Bitcoin 44%. That's not holding up well. That's people saying it's holding up well as it just keeps on bleeding, right? So when did ETH Bitcoin bottom last cycle? Was it the prevailing narrative? Was it what someone said on Twitter or what someone said on YouTube? Or did it bottom when the Fed shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing? If you think that I'm cherry picking Cardano and Ethereum to support this narrative, which is a fair accusation, so let me explain myself. If you were to look at all Bitcoin pairs, this is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you will find that the collective altcoin market also bottomed when we shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. We only took out that low a couple of times later, just on major parabolic rallies by Bitcoin. But you can clearly see that ADA fell in the same basket as the general altcoin market. It bottomed when the Fed went from reducing their balance sheet to increasing it, and it never had to be any more complicated than that. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to convince people of this with Ethereum, with really not a lot of luck. And I've tried the same thing with a lot of altcoins, and again, very mixed amount of luck. And the reason has been and continues to be that they say that, well, it'll outperform Bitcoin in a bull market. But there's two types of bull markets, is I think what a lot of people are missing. There are QE bull markets and there are QT bull markets. In a QT bull market, if you look at ADA Bitcoin, in a QT bull market for Bitcoin USD, let me pull up Bitcoin USD on this chart, and we will try to make it so it's a little bit easier to read here. So let me switch this to a log scale. So you can see that this is 2019 over here, right? When Bitcoin was going up over here during QT, ADA Bitcoin went down. When Bitcoin was going up over here during QE, right, during QE, ADA Bitcoin was going up. Here, Bitcoin USD found this low in November. It's been going up. ADA Bitcoin has not been going up like it did over here in 2020 and 2021, right? It's been going down since then. The reason is because we're still in QT. We have not yet gone back to QE. So again, like it's making a lot of people really frustrated. I mean, a lot of people are at each other's throats. My only hope back in early 2022, my goal was to try to prevent people from experiencing this pain that they're experiencing now with these altcoins that just keep seeming like they're bleeding against Bitcoin and they just won't stop. And Bitcoin goes up and the altcoin doesn't go up as much. And then Bitcoin corrects and then the altcoin corrects more, right? I experienced that last cycle, and my goal was to try to help people avoid that. And instead, I think what happens, I just piss a lot of people off, right? But that was my experience. So where is ADA Bitcoin today, right? Where is it today? Well, it's at about 831 sats. So, all of my views over the last 2.5 years, at this point in time for ADA Bitcoin, I would argue have been correct. That's not necessarily true, though, for ADA USD. And I will talk about that in a little bit. ADA Bitcoin, as of right this minute, is basically about as low as it's been, with the exception of this wick over here. It's about as low as it's been for this entire move down, right? The point of all of that was to say, look, guys, I know you like Cardano, I know you like ADA, but during QT, you're probably going to be better off with Bitcoin. It's nothing personal against Cardano. It's nothing personal. It's just, this is the reality of the situation. And this was the reality of the situation in 2019 that I refused to accept. I didn't want to accept it, right? And so what I did was I bought ADA throughout this entire phase. And at one point, eventually the Fed pivoted, ADA Bitcoin bottomed, and I was just like, well, hell, I could have just stuck with Bitcoin during that entire time, taken on a lot less risk, and gotten a lot more reward. Because after all this time, ADA Bitcoin dropped 95%, even during a Bitcoin bull market. Now, we didn't put in new highs, but we still had a Bitcoin bull market. So how is this time different? Well, look, this trend line here that I know a lot of my biggest critics have been sort of focused on, it looks like it's breaking, right? I have been fairly clear that I think that it will break, right? What would cause ADA Bitcoin to bottom out here, right? I'm having I'm trying to have like a discussion in my mind of like what would actually cause it to bottom out here. The only thing that I could think of would be that if something catastrophic happens and the Fed pivots a lot sooner than anyone's expecting. One other thing, we talked about how ADA Bitcoin bottomed, when the Fed pivoted from QT to QE, right? So let me overlay this on the chart. So we can see that. It also, though, bottomed after the Fed cut rates as well. So if you were to overlay US interest rates onto this chart, you can pretty clearly see that ADA Bitcoin did not bottom until after the Fed cut rates. Now, this cycle, the Fed has not yet cut rates, and they also have not shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So my bias is still that ADA Bitcoin will bleed. With that said, that doesn't mean that it goes down in a straight line. Although for the last couple of months, it really has done that. So I'm making this video right now knowing that there is a possibility that it could bounce off of the range low. If it does, I just think it will be a temporary bounce, kind of like maybe this one over here, right? You can see that it came back down, it got a little bit of a bounce, and then ultimately bled much lower. With that said, I'm still not even convinced we're going to get that bounce, considering that we already spent a lot of time trying to hold right here at 1100 sats and we're unable to do so, which was basically the same area that it tried to hold over here. So this is the issue for ADA Bitcoin. This is the issue for ADA. What happens if it goes below this level? Right? What happens if it goes below this level? Well, we can look at case studies, and I can walk you through what has historically happened on various alt Bitcoin pairs or various alt USD pairs once their Bitcoin valuations break below key support levels. But, and then maybe I should do that. But this is the level to watch. 800 sats. All right. My bias is to think that it will go below 800 sats. That's my bias. I've been pretty clear about that for the last 2 years. It's been a long journey here. We've come down to it a couple of times. We've bounced off of it a couple of times. We're now down here a third time. That is my bias, is that we will break below it. However, I could understand why someone might be more optimistic. They might say, well, what if this is like this down here? You know, what if, you know, in terms of where we are in the cycle, you know, this is the halving year. And this in the halving year over here, you can see that ADA Bitcoin was putting in supports that it ultimately built off of. So I'm not blind to that. I mean, I can see that that occurred. However, this also bottomed out after the Fed cut rates and once looser monetary policy arrived, which still has not yet happened. So that's why I'm not yet convinced of that. And one great example that many examples you can look at is there's so many other altcoins that are already breaking support. So why should ADA be any different, right? Matic Bitcoin has broken support pretty clearly, right? It broke support. And, you know, it broke support the week of March 11th. And ever since it broke, I mean, look how long it took to break support. A weekly close below the range low. It finally got that weekly close below the range low the week of March 11th. And ever since then, it just keeps on going down. I remember this pattern. This was exactly what ADA Bitcoin did over here. After it broke this range low, look what ADA Bitcoin did, right? It finally got a weekly close below it, and then it just went down for like 2 months straight. And then it finally bottomed out, and then it slowly trended back up. So you can see that this is already happening with some alts. They're breaking support. Now, Matic Bitcoin broke support the week of March 11th. What has Matic USD done since the week of March 11th? Because everyone, the Bitcoin valuation is what is the only thing that matters. But for some reason, you guys care more about the USD valuation. But ever since March 11th, Matic USD has gone down, right? So when alts break support against Bitcoin, then they usually start to bleed on their USD pairs. So that's why this 800 sat level is a very important level for Cardano. If it holds, then perhaps it doesn't have to meet the fate that I've outlined of just sort of bleeding back down to the range lows. However, my bias will be, and it will continue to be, and it has been for the last 2 years, that as long as the Fed has not pivoted, I think the bias remains down for all Bitcoin pairs collectively, although we can always identify a few that are going against that trend. That is my view, right? So even if there is a bounce, right? Even if ADA does bounce against Bitcoin here, and let's say it goes back all the way up to 11 or 1200 sats, I'm sure I would get a lot of snarky comments, right? But my view would not change. Like, I would still think it's still going to inevitably roll over and break. Now, what would change my mind? Well, if ADA Bitcoin, let's say we're sometime off in the future, 6 months from now or something, if it's still holding above 800 sats and, you know, and we're away from QT and we're back in QE, then I will think that, you know, I might change my mind, right? But that hasn't happened yet, right? So how can I be compelled to change my mind? Nothing I have said about ADA Bitcoin has been wrong. I mean, it's just been bleeding for a long time. Now, one thing that I was looking at with, you know, sort of ADA Bitcoin is, as I've said before, altcoins are oscillators at best, right? It's a tale as old as time. So if it's an oscillator at best, then you have somewhat of a well-defined range here, okay? And so if it is an oscillator, which again is an if, it's already down 87%, right? It's already down 87%. If it were to go to the bottom of this range, that's another 50% drop by ADA Bitcoin. Okay? That might sound like a lot. But over here, it dropped 95%. Even if it did drop from there down to here, that would still be diminishing losses if it were to bottom out at 400 sats. The reason why I was never convinced, and I'm still not, I don't think that this trend line will hold, and it still looks like it looks like it's breaking it now. But again, horizontal support lines are more important than diagonals. So I don't think that you should put a lot of faith in this diagonal trend line. I never have. I'm just saying other people that view these videos have sort of said, well, why does he draw the trend line and then say it's not going to hold? The reason I said that was because if you look at ADA ETH, it didn't hold the trend line, right? I mean, you could draw similar trend lines for ADA ETH, right? And, bounced off of it, but eventually it fell below it. And a while back, I did a video on Cardano where I talked about, if I can find this parallel channel, where we talked about ADA ETH and basically said that, let me switch this to a log. It's already on a log scale. Hold on. But basically, what I said was that a lot of these altcoins, they essentially are oscillators, right? At best, right? And I don't know exactly how to. You could connect the dots like this, and if you just ignore this wick, then you can connect the dots like this and say, you have this low, this low, this low, and then you have this high. You have a high here. You have a high here, but it's still a fairly convincing downtrend channel, right? Don't get mad at me, right? Take it up with the data. I don't control what's happening. I'm just telling you this is what's happening. Back over here in the summer of 2023, I have a video on Cardano, and I said in that video that I thought the most likely outcome in the short term was for it to go back up here on its Ether pair to tag this trend line before rate cuts arrive. Why did I say that back then? Because if you look at interest rates, you can see that, well, that's exactly what it did last cycle, was it went back up to sort of the mid part of this trend line, tagged it before rate cuts arrived, but it fell off before those rate cuts arrived, right? Same thing is happening here, right? It tagged this trend line, sort of the mid part of the channel. Rate cuts haven't arrived yet, right? In fact, when it tagged the trend line, when it tagged that trend line, it was about halfway through the pause. This trend line was tagged basically back in December. So perhaps that indicates we are getting close to rate cuts in the next few months. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, Ben, you're wrong because the market's saying rate cuts aren't coming till September. And the market could be right, or like they have been for a long time, the market could be wrong, where they're constantly pricing in stuff based on the most recent data, but they're ignoring the things that matter more, right? I mean, inflation, yes, it was a hot print, but that can change, right, easily in a couple of months, and rate cuts could get priced back in. I have said many, many times that the pricing out of rate cuts will cause them to be priced back in. Earlier this year, the market was expecting 6 rate cuts. Now they're only expecting 2 this year. So how can we put that much faith in what the market thinks if they've gone from 6 cuts to 2 cuts in 4 months, in 3.5 months? You can't put a lot of weight into this stuff because from 6 cuts to 2 cuts. But here's the issue. As rate cuts get priced out, it causes companies to throw in the towel because they're trying to survive until rate cuts arrive, right? Until looser monetary policy arrives. Hopefully that increases demand, right? They're trying to survive. As they keep getting pushed further and further out, more and more companies give up. If you don't believe me, you can see it pretty clearly, right? If you go look at U.S., if we just go look at bankruptcies in the United States, right? If you go look at bankruptcies, it's still relatively low, right? I'm not trying to raise the alarm, but it's trending up. It's trending up pretty clearly. The green line is, this is interest rates, and the white line is bankruptcies. This is 3 months, but these are bankruptcies. and there's a lag on it, right? I mean, it only shows it through October. It only shows it through Q4 of last year, but we should get a new data point soon. But bankruptcies are going up, right? And you can see that interest rates go up, bankruptcies go up. So the same thing applies over to crypto. As looser monetary policy gets pushed further and further out, higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets, and that's why ADA bleeds to Bitcoin. That's why ETH bleeds to Bitcoin. That's why Polkadot bleeds to Bitcoin. That's why Matic bleeds to Bitcoin, right? Link bleeds to Bitcoin. Litecoin bleeds to Bitcoin, right? It's nothing personal. It's just this is what happens during tighter monetary policy. And you can accept it, or you can pretend like it doesn't happen. You can, of course, cherry pick altcoins, new altcoins that are smaller market caps and say, you're wrong, I'm wrong, whatever. But this is the general trend. And you don't have to look any further than alt Bitcoin pairs. And my concern is that the pricing out of these rate cuts, we're now from 6 rate cuts to 2. What if that's what it takes to finally make alt Bitcoin pairs break down? What's fascinating is that last cycle, once the range low was set on altcoins against their Bitcoin pairs, it took 41 weeks for them to break down. From this low here, we're currently at 41 weeks. Now, I don't know if they're going to break down this week or not. I think there could be a case to be made for next week during the halving as well. But you can see that in a lot of ways, this time is not different. It's taking about the same amount of time as it took last cycle. It's just that we reached this point here about 3 quarters later than last cycle. And so we still inevitably at some point have to face the rate cut part of the cycle. And the rate cut part of the cycle generally comes right after the breakdown. And by generally, I mean based on the one data point that we have. After the breakdown of alt Bitcoin pairs. If I'm wrong, look to this chart to prove it. Look to see if alt Bitcoin pairs can hold above 0.4. Or in ADA's case, if it can hold above 800 sats. I don't think it will. But if I'm wrong, this is where I would be wrong at. It would be at this level. It would be at 800 sats. Because if it goes below 800, Matic shows you what happens. When it breaks support, it's not pretty. It just starts to bleed. So if I'm wrong about ADA Bitcoin from this point, I would say I've been right about it for the last 2 years, but sometimes I ride the trend a bit too long. If I'm wrong about it, this is where I would be wrong about it. Because if it goes below here, I think it's going to 400 sats. That's my view. That's my view. And it's been my view for forever. So this is where it needs to hold if I'm going to be at all compelled to change my view. I think it's going to break. Prove me wrong, and we'll see. But that is my view, and I'll keep a close eye on it. I don't know if it's going to get a little bounce like this or not, but it is getting dangerously close. And the reason why this is an issue is because the halving is next week, and if Bitcoin rallies into the halving, just like it rallied into the spot ETF, and ADA Bitcoin is already on a very precarious level, if it can't keep up during that rally, then ADA Bitcoin could be broken off support. And then when Bitcoin stalls out sometime later after the halving, you can see here after the ETF, it stalled out and went down. That's when you could see ADA Bitcoin. It's already lost support during a Bitcoin rally. And then when Bitcoin gets a correction, it no longer has that support level to hold on to. And then you end up getting something like what's happening with Matic Bitcoin. And it's not just Matic, right? I mean, it's, you can look at Aave Bitcoin. I mean, it just keeps on breaking support after support. Litecoin Bitcoin. I mean, bleeding against Bitcoin is what Litecoin does best, So it's a very precarious situation. One of the ways I think that might be helpful about to understand Satoshi valuations, because I think a lot of people really struggle with thinking about things. Like, it's kind of abstract, like, oh, 800 sats, 400 sats, 1600 sats. Like, what does that even mean, really, for a lot of people? A lot of people don't really know. It's not like tangible to them, right? But there's a way that I think you can make it more tangible, and that's to take the inverse. So you go up here and you take 1 divided by ADA Bitcoin. Okay? Now, when you do this, you can pretty clearly see a nice compelling trend, and that is, look at this, or a way that it's not so abstract. Right now, 1 Bitcoin will get you 120,000 ADA. In August 2021, 1 Bitcoin got you 16,000 ADA. In early 2022, I was very clear that altcoins were too risky and they were going to bleed to Bitcoin until dominance hit 60%, right? That was back when ADA Bitcoin was at, or sorry, the inverse, 1 Bitcoin would fetch you about 35,000 ADA, right? So I didn't pivot on it at that level. It was more so Q1 2022, where I finally was like, all right, alt Bitcoin pairs are going to bleed. Back then, 1 Bitcoin would get you about 38,000 ADA. Today, it gets you 120,000 ADA. Look at this trend here. This is the trap that I fell for last cycle. Do you see this? We came up to this level and got rejected by it, came all the way back down here. We didn't even make it down there yet in this cycle. You can see it wasn't even as big of a drop here. And then after dropping, we then came up and then broke through it. So we essentially went from 1 Bitcoin getting you 11,000 ADA here, if we get a price label, to giving you 11,000 ADA there, to giving you 250,000 ADA up there. Here, it gave you 16,000 ADA. Right now, it's at 120, about 120,000 or so. Okay? So, if I'm wrong about ADA Bitcoin, it has to be at this point, in my view. Otherwise, if it breaks above this, it's just going to go to the range high, right? I mean, there's just not, I just don't think there would be a lot standing in its way. Just like over here, there wasn't a lot standing in its way once it broke through. And it's been, it's been at this level for a while, and that's my concern, is that it's going to break through and come up to this level, right? So that's, I think, something that is worthwhile to consider. Now, where have I not been as correct about Cardano? Because that's something that I think it's easy for a lot of people to sort of highlight what they've been right about and sort of brush under the rug things they've been wrong about, because it's not cool to sort of highlight that. You want to be known for only making correct calls and for having a crystal ball, but I have news. I don't have a crystal ball, and I get a lot of things wrong. And the only thing, with ADA USD is that back over here in 2023, I did think it was going to go lower than where it went, 23 cents. I'm not going to try to hide and pretend like I didn't think that. I did. My understanding was, thinking that Bitcoin would get a larger correction at the time, and I was wrong. But I think that the thing to consider here is that ADA USD went up, but not because of anything great going on in the altcoin market. It just went up because Bitcoin went up. Because while ADA USD did technically go up, ADA Bitcoin got a little bit of a bump, right? But then it's just right back down, right? It's just right back down. And ADA USD is probably the most puzzling thing for Cardano. I feel very convinced about where its Bitcoin valuation is going. I feel very convinced about where its like ETH valuation is going. And I don't think I actually expressed that, so let me express it really quick. For the ETH valuation, my general thought is that, it probably does something like this, where it comes back down and then maybe over here gets a move back up. It's kind of my view on ADA ETH. something like that, probably. So I feel very, strong about A to Bitcoin, or this is inverse of A to Bitcoin. I feel very strong about A to Bitcoin, A to ETH. A to USD is a bit more puzzling because it's going to depend on Bitcoin, right? I mean, it's just going to come down to that. And if Bitcoin goes up, it can lift ADA with it, right? Just like it did here, right? I mean, just like it did here, Bitcoin went up and it took ADA with it. So if Bitcoin goes up, I mean, it can take Cardano with it. If Bitcoin goes down, it's going to take Cardano in that direction. So ADA USD comes down to what Bitcoin USD does. My argument is that ADA Bitcoin and ADA ETH doesn't come down to that. And that's why understanding Bitcoin dominance has been so useful, because for the last 2 years, if you agreed with me that dominance was going to go up, then there really wasn't a compelling case to be super heavy into ADA. And I mean, you can say whatever you want to, but the reality of ADA Bitcoin is, it's now down 86%, 87% from the highs, right? And even from when I was very vocal about it in 2022, early 2022, right? It's still down like 68% since that time. So yeah, sorry, I heard a noise. Maybe it's the Cardano people, but so that is at least something that I've spent a lot of time like sort of thinking about, trying to wrap my head around like what is ADA USD going to do. It's really hard to know. It's going to be based on what Bitcoin does. And my thought on Bitcoin is, take a look at this. We saw Bitcoin USD rally into the spot ETF. Remember? And actually, about 1 week before the spot ETF, Bitcoin USD swept the high. We're almost at a week before the halving. If Bitcoin, look at this diagonal that Bitcoin USD was sort of holding. It's kind of doing the same thing here, right? Holding a diagonal as it goes into a major event. This was the spot ETF. So if Bitcoin gets this move into the halving, and let's say after that, it gets a pullback to sort of sweep that low. Let's say, again, I don't know. I don't know what it's going to do. I have absolutely no idea. I'm just saying, like, if it does do something like this, whether this holds or not, in my opinion, is going to be dependent on if alt Bitcoin pairs have collectively broken down. So if alt Bitcoin pairs have broken down below 0.4, then I think there's a decent chance Bitcoin could get a larger correction. If you look at 2019, during quantitative tightening and high rates, the larger correction occurred. All these corrections that it previously had were only like 10, 15% drops. It finally had a larger drop, but when that larger drop occurred, it didn't occur until after alt Bitcoin pairs broke down the week of June 24th. That's what marked the local top for Bitcoin, was the week of June 24th. So if the same thing happens, I think you have to keep an eye on alt Bitcoin pairs. Look at it like this. If you look at Bitcoin USD overlaid onto this chart, you will see right here, when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, that's where Bitcoin USD found a local top. So they haven't broken down yet, and we still have the halving coming up. But if they do break down into the halving, you have to wonder, will that mark at least a local top? If you think about it, Bitcoin had a local top in April of last year, before it had about a 2-month drop or so. Look at this. The week of April 10th, local top for a while. Look at 2021, the week of April 12th, right? So you have the week of April 12th, the week of April 10th. Guess what? 2013, the week of, or sorry, that's 2011. Here's 2013, the week of April 8th. April is an important time for Bitcoin, right? And so a lot of times you do see pullbacks into May, just like we had here, just like we had here, and just like we had over here. So if Bitcoin rallies into the halving and it breaks ADA Bitcoin off support, off of 800 sats, and if at that point Bitcoin USD rolls over into May and gets a correction, and ADA Bitcoin is already below support, then it could do something like what Matic Bitcoin is doing, where it breaks support, and then after it breaks support, then the USD valuation starts to bleed back down. That is something that I spend a lot of time looking at are the Bitcoin valuations. If, on the other hand, Bitcoin does not get a correction after the halving and keeps going up, then ADUSD could go up with it, right? My only point is that in either case, if you agree with my view, right, if ADA Bitcoin goes down no matter what, then I've been under the opinion that just be Bitcoin heavy until looser monetary policy arrives. And then, sometime after that, not immediately, because even when it arrives, it's probably arriving for the wrong reason. But that's been my view, right? Exposure to crypto, I think, especially with the larger market cap alts, you're better off with Bitcoin because it's outperforming. Bitcoin dominance is going up. And yes, I was wrong about ADUSD right here. I hold my hand up high, right? I was wrong about it. But I will say, I think the reason it's gone up, and again, this is me rationalizing, right, is because Bitcoin went up. It's not because of any other reason. And so, if Bitcoin keeps going up, it can take ADA with it, but you still would have just been better off with Bitcoin as ADA Bitcoin bleeds. What you look for this trend to change is looser monetary policy to arrive. So until looser monetary policy arrives, why would I change my bias? So that's my view. If you look at ADUSD without any of the monetary policy stuff or the Bitcoin valuation stuff, I can certainly see how you would come to a completely different conclusion. And I don't think it's fair to completely discount that view. If you look at the cycles here, you can see that ADA-USD had this bear market. It then went up, back down, and then back up, came down. And then if you ignore the pandemic, right, it just came up here and then fell back into the bull market support band before slowly grinding higher and then going up a lot, right? So look at it like this. This is down, down, right? Up, down, up, down, up, back down to the range low, back down to the range low. Ignore the pandemic, right? Just pretend like it didn't happen. You go up, and then you go back to the bull market support band, right? You go up, and then you go back to the bull market support band, right? Which we kind of already did. We bounced off of it, and now we're back to it, right? So if you were only looking at this, I completely get that view, right? And that's why I've said I'm more puzzled by ADA-USD than ADA Bitcoin or ADA ETH. My view is that if ADA-USD goes up, it's only because Bitcoin's going up a lot more, right? If Bitcoin goes to 80K, it can take the altcoin market with it, but it's still probably going to outperform the altcoin market. So you could get a situation where ADA Bitcoin breaks down, but ADA-USD is not breaking down in the same way. My base case is that ADA Bitcoin breaks down and that ADA-USD sort of sees a pullback, a substantial pullback. But this is also a potential outcome. And the reason why I have to highlight that is I was wrong about ADA-USD here, right here. So I could be wrong. Maybe my view is not worthwhile to consider right here. Honestly, on ADA-USD, I think I have a better grip on its Bitcoin valuation and its ETH valuation. And the reason is because I think that no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, ADA Bitcoin goes down until looser monetary policy arrives. No matter the direction of ETH USD, I think ADA ETH goes down until looser monetary policy arrives. But ADA-USD does depend on the direction of Bitcoin USD, whereas I don't think ADA Bitcoin does. So ADA-USD is much more difficult to forecast, in my opinion, than ADA Bitcoin. If ADA Bitcoin breaks support, then I do think ADA USD will drop. Just like Matic Bitcoin broke support, Matic USD is dropping. Just like last cycle, we saw altcoins break support against Bitcoin, and then alt USD valuations dropped for a while. This trend here will be dependent on, does it hold at this bull market support band like it did in 2020? Does it hold there or does it not? You know? And I don't know. You could argue that this phase right here is like that phase. Or you could argue that this phase here is like this phase. In fact, it looks more like that phase if you were to take a bar pattern, right? If you just line this up here, right? If you look at that and you put it right here, like this to me still looks more like this than it does this little one over here. And what's interesting is if you overlay US interest rates onto this chart, you will see that this pattern here emerged right before rate cuts arrived. What if this pattern here is emerging right before rate cuts arrive? And so as alt Bitcoin pairs break down and alt USD valuations roll over, that represents the consumer finally becoming weak, and then the Fed cuts rates. And then they shift from QT to QE. Alt Bitcoin pairs bottom just at the last minute where I finally convince everyone that Bitcoin dominance is going to go up. But by the time the last person believes in the Bitcoin dominance rally, that's when the dominance rally is over. I don't think the dominance rally is over yet. If you look at Bitcoin dominance, it's been slowly building up to the range highs. There's been a lot of people that have completely ignored dominance for years, right? They cherry pick micro cap alts to say why dominance doesn't matter. They say, well, ETH is holding up well against Bitcoin. Down 40% is not holding up well. You know, if you look at quarterly returns for asset pairs like ETH Bitcoin, this is now the 6th quarter in a row where it's potentially red. Now, we still have a long time to go in this quarter, so we don't know. But let's take a look at the same thing for ADA Bitcoin. Look at ADA Bitcoin. Look at this. 2022, ADA Bitcoin was entirely red. 2023, it was red 3 of 4 quarters. And so far this year, it's only red. There's been 1 quarter. And look at this. Even the Q4 of 2021 was red, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Out of the last, well, I guess, I mean, if you just take it from here, right? So this is 4, 8, 10, 11, if you include this one. So out of the last, if this is also assuming this current quarter stays red. Out of the last 11 quarters, ADA Bitcoin has been green 1 quarter, right? 1 quarter out of the last 11. By the time I convince the last person, the downtrend could be over, you know? We're probably not that far away because I think that rate cuts and shifts in monetary policy are going to occur this year. This is what I was trying to help people avoid. But as I said earlier, I think instead of helping people avoid it, or I hope some people did, I think I just made a lot of enemies. So next cycle, I can practically guarantee you that I'm not going to be going on this, mission to convince everyone of these altcoins bleeding against Bitcoin during QT. Because it doesn't get you anywhere, right? It just makes people mad at you. And if the asset goes up on its USD pair, they never forgive you, even if it's bleeding on its Bitcoin pair, because people only care about, for whatever reason, they only care about USD valuations. If you look at ADA USD, you go to assets here and you look at just Cardano, it doesn't look as bad, right? I mean, there's still a lot of red, but there's also some green, right? There was a 62% move in 2023, right there, early 2023, and in Q4, 133% move. Q1, 9%, Q2, negative 9%. So it doesn't look as bad on its USD valuation, but let's suppose you carried out a DCA strategy where ever since the beginning of 2022 to the current day, you bought $100 worth of Bitcoin and you bought it weekly on Monday, you would have put in $11,900. Your current portfolio valuation would be worth 30.5K. Let's say you did the same thing for ADA. So you'd be up 156% had you done DCA strategy for Bitcoin really since the bear market began in early 2022. If you did the same thing for ADA, you'd only be up 46%. So anyone who followed a DCA strategy for ADA can still feel good at the current time on its USD valuation because it's still up 46%. And you can be mad at me for being like, well, you said it was going to go down. But the reality is that you still would have been better off with Bitcoin by a lot. And you would have taken on less risk and you would have had more reward. This won't go on, forever. There will be a time where ADA Bitcoin gets a more sustained bounce. I just don't think it occurs until looser monetary policy arrives. That's my view. I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm going to stick through it this cycle, but next cycle, I'm done with it. It's not my mission anymore after this. But that's something to consider. Now, if we go back over here to the asset filter for Cardano, we can look at a few things. We talk about Bitcoin dominance a lot. Look at ADA dominance. Where is it right now? It's at 0.795%. ADA dominance this past cycle on the daily actually went higher than it was last cycle. That's not something you see a lot of altcoins do. It does happen sometimes, but it's not something you see frequently. Where did it bottom last cycle? It bottomed at a dominance of between 0.5 to 0.6. It's currently at, just around 0.8. So I'm arguing that, maybe it needs to come down here to 0.5 to 0.6. If you look at the risk on Cardano, where is the risk right now? 0.463. That's the current risk on ADA, 0.463. Again, if you bought here, you're doing quite well right now. Still would have been better off with Bitcoin. At some point, that changes in terms of a short-term move. But when it changes, that trend likely only lasts a year. If you look at ADA Bitcoin, what do you notice? Yes, it was slowly trending up over here, but the big move, it doesn't even last a year, right? I mean, it just lasts a few months, right? These moves last a few months, and then everyone spends years dreaming about them again, right? They only last a few months. So the reality with altcoins is that they bleed against Bitcoin for most of the cycle. They get a rapid move up at some point, and then everyone spends the next 3.5 years wishing for it again. And they wish for alt season. And while they keep wishing for alt season, Bitcoin dominance goes up. So, just something to think about. Going back to some of the charts, let's see what the long-term holders are doing for ADA. So, it looks like it went down a little bit. It's not as, Bitcoin long-term holder. It's gone down from 55% down to 48%. So if you were to look at short-term holder HODL waves, you can see there's been a little bit of an uptick recently as the price of ADA went up. If we were to look at, I don't know, what do you guys want to look at? As if you can respond right now. Here's the MVRVZ score for ADA. Still pretty low. Look at it for Bitcoin. It's been doing a lot better. The issue is you can see last cycle going into rate cuts, Bitcoin also saw the MVRVZ score go to around these levels. And you can see that in 2019, ADA didn't go nearly as high as Bitcoin did on its MVRVZ score in that 2019 move compared to what it eventually did later. Once QE returned, once looser monetary policy arrived. I'm not really sure what else there is to talk about with it. You guys generally know my views at this point. Here's a drawdown from the all-time high on its USD valuation. Here it is on its Bitcoin valuation. Right? We spent a long time down here, right? You can even see at one point there was a little divot back up and then it came back down, kind of like this, right? A little divot back up and then it just came back down. let's take a look at the days since percentage decline. How long has it been since ADA had a 30% drop? It's been about 215 days. The record is about 253 days or so, maybe a little bit more. 257 days is the record. We're currently at 215 days, right? So again, I mean, like, it's due at some point for a correction, maybe sometime after the halving for Bitcoin. There are some other charts that you could look at that are a little bit more optimistic. I think some of them are like ROI after the low could be one. Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at this one compared to last cycle, you know, I mean, we could just be in a phase where we just sort of slowly bleed a little bit and get one more pop up, maybe on a Bitcoin rally, and then it just fades. If you look at it on ROI after cycle peak out to the next peak, look at this. Look how close this looks. The funny thing is, if it were to go down to the last cycle, where the last cycle was, it would actually put it at the range lows, right? At the range, you know, at its prior range lows. If it were to just simply go back down to where it was last cycle at this time. And you can see that it was after the peak at this time where it did slowly roll over for a few weeks, right? So you could get a scenario where it just simply drops back down and still doing what it did last cycle. I don't know if that always, I mean, does every cycle, here's Litecoin. I mean, so you can see not every cycle always stays above the prior cycle, right? So here is, you know, this is cycle, the blue line cycle 1, and then the orange line is cycle 2. You can see that it did come down and tag the prior cycle some, but then if you compare 2 to 3, you can see that 3 has gone below 2, right? So that's why, you know, you can't look at this and then, you know, unilaterally declare that it can't go back down to where the prior cycle was. You can see with other coins that it does sometimes happen. And I imagine XRP is another example, right? Yeah, where it sometimes happens. The first cycle, you know, so the first cycle was the blue line. The second cycle was this orange line. So the second cycle was worse, in fact. And then second cycle to third cycle, you can see that this cycle for XRP has been a little bit better than the last cycle, as measured from peak to peak. So, I mean, I guess my general view on Cardano is that I assume that ADA Bitcoin will bleed. I assume that ADA ETH will bleed until loose monetary policy arrives. ADA USD, I think it's just going to be dependent on what Bitcoin USD does. And because I don't know what Bitcoin USD is going to do, because I can't predict, you know, what these short-term moves are going to do, I would still argue that Bitcoin dominance is going to go up. You're better off with Bitcoin than a lot of these altcoins, and that after loose monetary policy arrives, I will change my view. I don't apologize for it. It has not been wrong to be bearish on ADA Bitcoin for the last 2.5 years. There's narratives, there's stories about what's causing it to go down, all sorts of stories, and then you can simply go look at monetary policy and see what actually caused it to turn around last cycle was going from QT to QE. QT, no QE yet. So I'm not going to change my view. Prove me wrong by holding 800 sats as support. If it goes below 800 sats, I think 400 sats is next support. Where does 400 sats put it? Well, it depends on what the price of Bitcoin is. You know, here's this Wolfram Alpha. So at 830 sats at a 70, what is Bitcoin right now? Bitcoin's basically at 71K, right? So at 71K, that puts ADA at, you know, 59 cents, right? Which is exactly where it is. You can see ADA USD is at right around 59 cents. At 75,000 Bitcoin, 830 sats puts ADA USD at 62 cents, right? So you can see that if ADA Bitcoin holds support, Bitcoin USD could go up and ADA USD could go up with it, even though ADA Bitcoin hasn't gone up. But what happens if ADA Bitcoin breaks support and goes to, say, 600 sats, right? Let's say it goes to 600 sats and Bitcoin's at 75K. Then you have an ADA that's at 45 cents. What happens if Bitcoin gets a large correction back down to 40K and ADA Bitcoin is at 600 sats, right? Then it's back to 24 cents, which is back down to the range lows, right? So you can kind of see, I mean, ADA USD is going to be completely dependent on Bitcoin, completely dependent on Bitcoin. I think ADA Bitcoin and ADA ETH are not dependent on Bitcoin USD, which finalizes the discussion for today for me with Cardano. And what I've said is that Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside during quantitative tightening at high rates while also minimizing your downside risk. You can get mad at me for being bearish on ADA Bitcoin for the last 2.5 years, or you can accept the fact that 10 of the last 11 quarters have been red for ADA Bitcoin. And by the time the last person is convinced, will probably be right around the time that rate cuts arrive. And that's probably when the market trend shifts and we go back the other way. And I just want people to understand my views, why I think that, what I've been right about, what I've been wrong about, not try to hide behind it. I'm trying to learn as I go. ADA USD, if you want to be optimistic on it, see if it can hold the bull market support band. That is currently at 56 to 58 cents, right? So as long as it's holding that, there's still a hope, right? But look, if it breaks below like there and gets a weekly close well below it and then just sort of keeps dropping, then the trend could last for several more months. If you do something like this where it holds as support, then maybe there's more upside, right? It really depends on what happens here at this bull market support band. So keep an eye on the bull market support band for ADA USD, the 20-week SMA, the 21-week EMA. For ADA Bitcoin, just keep an eye on 800 sats. Below 800, I think it's going to 400. If you want to prove me wrong, have it hold at 800. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.